So, welcome to the Bob Porco podcast, whatever its name is. What are we going to call this?
I don't know. This is the Bob Porco podcast.
The Unnamed Bob Porco podcast, and my first guest, the historic Terri Thal.
Wow, thank you.
We're going to get into a little bit more about who you are and how your connections to the Greenwich Village scene developed and what transpired in the last 65 years since.
My God.
For those who...
Has it been that long?
It's been that long.
Wow.
Yeah, we won't say your age here, but...
I don't care.
Well, maybe
As you know,
during the conversation.
I'm fine about it.
Some people might just call you one thing or another. They might say Dave Van Ronk's wife or ex-wife.
Ex-wife.
Or,
Yeah.
which is not so bad, to be called Bob Dylan's first manager when he was a young 20-something, 20.
Right.
So let me read something from your book. This is...
And I was too.
And you were just a year older, or a little bit...
I'm 1 year older. Yeah.
Touch older than him.
Bob, yeah.
So this is in Terri Thal's book, My Greenwich Village, Dave, Bob, and Me. If anyone was questioning whose Greenwich Village it is, it's Terri's. She declared. So there's been controversy about who convinced Mike Porco, my grandfather, by the way, the owner of Gerde's Folk City, to book Bob Dylan. It doesn't matter. Everyone in folk music wants to have helped Bob get started, to own a piece of his fame. I spent a lot of time nagging Mike to hire Bob. If others were doing the same, so be it. Mike finally told me that he would hire Bob Dylan, and when he did, he came through like a mensch. He accompanied Bob to the AFM and declared himself Bob's guardian, so Dylan, who was not yet 21, could get his union book. He also paid for photos, so Bob could get his cabaret card. And so off we go with Terri Thal. How did that transpire in the sense that, what did you see about Bob Dylan at Gerde's in 1961 when he showed up?
Well, I saw him, I didn't see him at Gerde's when he showed up. I saw him actually at the Cafe Wa. In the winter of 61, he hit New York, and he went straight to the Cafe Wa on MacDougal Street. He did a set there, and David happened to wander in and hear him. And he came home that night and said, I've heard this kid. You got to go hear him. He's a genius. So I trotted down to the Cafe Wa in the snow the next night, and I heard this kid, and I didn't know what I was hearing. I mean, I heard this kid, and he was sounded a little bit like Woody Guthrie and a little bit like Jack Elliott. And he was stumbling around on stage, and he was kind of cute, and he had this little corduroy cap, and he would doff his cap, and he wouldn't talk into the microphone. He looked totally uncoordinated. And he was playing old songs. He was playing Woody Guthrie stuff. There was something about him, though, I don't know whether it was his charm or his newness, that made you really look at him and say, what am I really seeing? I went home and I said, yeah, there's something there. I had no idea what it was. He stuck around, and he was around the village, and we became good friends. And should I go on? I mean, and sometime we became good friends, and he spent a lot of time at our place. He needed a place to stay, and we were all young.
So let's go back to that January 61 when he came to New York for the first time. He went to the WA. So he had to befriend the musicians first, mm-hmm. and others. Mm-hmm. And Woody was well known by the musicians. There weren't a lot of original artists yet. Ramblin' Jack had only been recording probably a couple of years at that point.
That's right.
Woody recorded in 44 and beyond, and for quite a while, but still not a lot of recorded music.
And of course the Weavers had been recorded.
Pete Seeger and the Weavers.
Pete Seeger and the Weavers, Cynthia Gooding. There were people who had
mm-hmm.
Paul Clayton. Pretty well recorded by then.
By 1960 he had already had something, and Tom Paxson, I think, in 1960 as well was his first.
No, Tom hadn't even shown up yet.
Oh, not yet? I thought he was there just a little before Dylan.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You're right. Tom had. But, people had. Mm-hmm. Dave had a record out. There were some records. Mm-hmm. There was some records out. There weren't a lot. It was sort of the beginning of what David called the folk scare.
Folk scare.
Yeah, the folk scare.
Right. The very beginning. So you were there. So we'll come back to Bob. My Greenwich Village, Dave, Bob, and Me by Terri Thal. So let's go in reverse order. Let's go back to the me part. So you ended up in the village. See what I did there? So you ended up in the village.
That was very neat.
How about
I
that?
admire that. Good ability.
And I read your book, and you spoke mostly about how you met Dave in 58 or 59, Dave and Ronk?
57. Actually, I met David in the winter of 56, 57, maybe early 57.
Mm-hmm.
I met him at the world was very small, Bob. Mm-hmm. It was a lot smaller than it is now.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to go into a thing about the history of the village and what the village was, and all that. But the kinds of people who hung around the village kind of all knew one another or knew of one another. I know people who say worlds were separated out in the village and the jazz musicians and the visual artists didn't know so-and-so and so-and-so. And I know people who say everybody knew everybody. I think it was really mixed. And I backed in because I was part of the left-wing movement. And without going into a whole big thing about folk music and the left-wing movement, which I can do if you want, but I'll spare you that. I was hanging around socialist organizations, not the Communist Party, which had a huge influence on bringing folk music back in the United States. I was part of other socialist organizations, and they all had their headquarters in the village. So I was hanging around the village. And because I was part of socialist organizations and they had their roots in the labor movement.
The music was reflected way. And so
thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a draw. Was that a draw or the draw for you to come to Greenwich Village, or was it?
No, it was a socialist. Mine was political. I went there because I went to socialist meetings. I went to lectures, I went to God knows what.
So the musician connections was happenstance.
It was happenstance, yeah. And I knew some of the folk music because Woody Guthrie and the Weavers and American industrial ballads and things like that had caught on, although they were promulgated by the American Communist Party. They had caught on with every section of the left wing, and then the Wobblies had their own songs. There is the Little Red, the Little Red Songbook with all the industrial songs. So it was all kind of connected.
It was coming together during that period.
Yeah. I went to these socialist meetings, and we sang union songs, I thought they were glorious. A lot of them were dreadful. They were trite, but I was 18, 17 when I started actually going to these organizations, and I thought they were great.
Had you heard those songs in recordings before then?
Yes.
Some
of them, yeah. I had some of the records. My sister went to Brandeis University, which was a very progressive new college, and she had brought home albums, the Talking Union album by Pete, by Pete and the Weavers. Yeah, I had heard them. An uncle who was a socialist, which I didn't realize, I had no idea, had given me albums of, folksy albums, of Pete and Woody and Cisco. I had no idea what they were, but they were, it was folk music. It was early folk music. Yeah, I had heard of that stuff.
Yeah.
And,
but it spoke to you when you're in the room with it and amongst the musicians
absolutely.
Seeing
or
other
among
people.
Among the socialist people.
Like-minded people.
Yeah. So
how frequently then did you come to the village then, since you were from Brooklyn?
Every week.
Every week
I got on the subway and I went to the village and I went to these interminably boring socialist discussions or someplace else. Or someplace else related. And there were a lot of related things. So, for example, one night I wound up at a party up on Riverside Drive. And Riverside Drive, for those who don't know anything about it, is on New York's Upper West Side, which at that time was a haven, a home for certain sections of the American intellectual community. And the apartments there were incredible. They were huge. Large and huge, and they had enormous rooms.
Right.
I swear each of those rooms was as big as my whole house.
Yeah, I've been in several, Beautiful. I love those buildings.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Riverside, like it says, it's, it's got a westerly view.
Yep. And literally, some of them were on the river. So there I was at this party. That particular party was thrown by science fiction fans. I don't know if you have ever heard of science fiction fandom.
Yeah, well, sure. I knew that it was huge. There was a lot of people who appreciated that back then, for sure. Yeah, it was a newish thing.
Yeah, it was. And so a lot of science fiction fan people knew the Socialists. They didn't necessarily agree. They just all knew each other. And for some reason, I was invited to this party. I went to this party, and there I was sitting in the party with some guy, and he was trying to get me to go into the bedroom. And I was 17 years old. 17 was pretty young in those days.
Yeah.
But I knew somehow, I could tell that he wasn't trying to get me to go into the bedroom for sex. And he finally said so, and he said he wanted to turn me on. Well, what did that mean? It meant that he wanted me to smoke marijuana. And again, here I was, this young girl from Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And to me, marijuana was dope. It was the stuff that had grown in the fields across from my high school in Bensonhurst in Brooklyn. And I was horrified. I was appalled. I was saying, no, go away. I don't do that. And this tall, skinny guy came out from someplace. And he came up to us and he said, leave her alone. And Dave Van Ronk and I spent the rest of the evening talking. And that
he was the tall, skinny guy.
He was skinny. Yes, David was once skinny.
Right.
And
and he was like 6'4"?
No, he was about 6'2".
6'2".
About
Still,
6'2".
that's tall. Even.
And I was just a smidgen under 5'11".
Right.
Which was very tall. Very, very tall for a woman at that time. And we spent the rest of the evening talking, and
no music at that party. It was
no
just
music.
Right.
Actually, that place was a place called the Dive, and it was occupied by a bunch of people who were part of the science fiction fan scene. And David was staying there at that time, which I didn't know, but I mean, it didn't matter.
Okay.
He had a room there.
And he was a science fiction fan as well?
David was...
Did he fit in? Did he fit in or didn't he
wasn't... He fit in.
Yeah.
He fit in.
Okay.
Yeah. He wasn't an ardent science fiction fan, but he knew those people, as I recall. We were both science fiction readers.
Yeah.
I mean, over the first years we lived together, I think we bought every science fiction paperback that was published. Yeah. The good ones, the lousy ones, we read them all. That, I don't know when that was. That was in the winter. And then the following early September, late August, early September, I was in the Figaro with a group of friends one night, and one of the guys...
The Figaro at Bleecker and MacDougal.
Figaro was a coffee house on the corner of Bleecker and MacDougal. It was not a folk music coffee house. It was a coffee house where everybody I knew hung out.
Do you know it's reopened under the same name again?
Yeah. And so I was sitting there with a bunch of friends, and David happened to be there, and he recognized me, and he came up to say hello, and he took me back to Brooklyn, and we were together for another 7 years.
Right, from that point, that second meeting.
Yeah.
Did you know he was a musician the first time you met him? Probably came in conversation, or not really?
I don't remember whether I don't remember whether I know. I really don't. I was still living in Brooklyn. I was still in college.
Yeah.
And I lived in Brooklyn I went to Brooklyn College. I lived at home for another 2 years until I graduated. And then we moved in together on 15th Street in Chelsea, which was not called Chelsea then. It wasn't called anything. It was just the fifth floor walk up in a neighborhood.
Yeah. I've been there. I lived in a fifth floor also at a different period, different time.
Right.
But yeah.
Tub and kitchen.
No, actually, this was the railroad apartment way up top, and
that's what this was, fifth floor.
Yeah. Pain in the butt climbing up there, but still people do it to this day. New York was always a draw for teenagers, 20-somethings. So you must have noticed at some point or another, before Bob Dylan came there, music was spilling into out of the coffee shops, coming from the center of the square on Sundays and being played more frequently.
I hung around. I went to Washington Square. I went to Washington. Even before I met Dave, I would occasionally, I often, not only on Friday nights, but at other times I would come to the Village and hang out in Washington Square.
Right.
At the folk music thing. And then when I met Dave, I started coming in and going to socialist meetings on Friday nights. Or meeting Dave. And David, who was a left-winger, when I met Dave considered himself an anarchist. But he did come to socialist meetings and eventually wound up in the socialist movement with me and considered himself a socialist until he died. Friday nights were political nights. Sundays, I don't know what we did Saturdays, we did something. And Sundays, when the weather was good, we went to the American Youth Hostel on 8th Street, where there was folk music. And then we went to Washington Square. And then after Washington Square, we went to 190 Spring Street, where you climbed up a whole bunch of stairs. And there was an apartment with a monkey and bluegrass. Mostly bluegrass, but other folk music as well. And that was Sunday. Sunday was folk music. Folk music.
Can you picture a time, can you pinpoint a time when it started to expand into not just Friday, Saturday, Sunday, but 7 days a week and a little more, let's say, opportunity for guitarists, singers?
That happened actually around 61. There was no way at all for a young folk singer to make a living. When I met Dave, I mean, he couldn't.
Other than busking,
there was no work.
Right.
Nobody could get paid at all.
No union. There was no forced union.
No. In fact, we set up an organization that I write about in the book called the Folk Singers Guild. Bunch of young New York people got together and set up an organization called the Folk Singers Guild. We produced concerts, and they featured those people. The proceeds of the door were divided among the performers, and the least amount of money the performers ever got paid was $1.
Least amount.
Least amount. Yeah, but that was what the audience drew. There was no money.
This is when beer was 15 cents a drink.
Something like that.
Yeah, so it was, $1 was something could get you home.
Yeah. I mean, but, it was nothing. In fact, in the book, I have a photograph of the list of the members of the Folk Singers Guild. And if you looked at it, I guarantee you would not recognize 3 of those names.
Oh, yeah.
Later on.
They all disappeared?
They all dropped out.
Yeah.
There was really not an impetus for them to stay and fight to become professional performers. In 1960, maybe, in fact, when Dave and I started living together, he went out and tried to get jobs. He could not make any money as a folk singer. He was teaching guitar. But he
privately,
wasn't
just individuals.
He wasn't performing.
Right.
There was no place to perform. Then John Mitchell opened the Gaslight.
58?
No.
Around that time,
no,
57?
No. Well, no, later than that.
Yeah?
I counted, it's funny because it was later than 57. I really counted around the time when he started bringing in folk singers. And just to explain to people, the early coffee houses that booked, quote, performers, booked poets. They did not book musicians. So that John Mitchell, who was a very strange, temperamental, slightly mad man, brought in poets to read, and a poet would read and a basket would be passed. Either the poets would pass the basket or a waitress, never a waiter, would pass the basket, and audience would put money in the basket, and that's how the poet would get paid.
Hence the name, the Basket House, for those who...
Hence the name, yeah, basket, yes, thank you.
Literal basket.
Yep. So you can't ask people to put their hands in their pockets for more than one poet. If John Brent reads and I pay to hear him, I am not going to pay again when Hugh Romney, known as Wavy Gravy, reads. So the owner of the coffee house has to get me out so that I will be replaced by a different audience who will then pay for Wavy Gravy.
So who would turn the room?
So how do you turn over the house? You hire folk singers because they're so awful. The audience is going to get up and flee when they come in. So John started booking folk singers. And we all know the rest of the story.
Right. Greenwich Village became the hotbed
of folk singers of folk music. And John, incidentally, crazy as he was, started paying salaries after a while. He actually...
Was his arm twisted?
No.
Yeah.
Nope. I never knew how that happened, but he did it. He actually started to pay people for the week or the weekend, whatever he was booking for.
Did he own the Wah and the Gaslight at the same time, or one and then the other?
I don't think he ever. I don't remember whether he ever owned the Wah.
We know Menachem Dworman owned the Wah.
Yeah.
His family still owns properties there, and the old folk city, actually, the Fat Black Pussycat now, the Dorman family, the Olive Tree. Also, one more thing about John Mitchell. Didn't he pick up and leave town? Did he just disappear?
He went.
He just disappeared.
He went, yeah. At some point.
Yeah.
At some point.
Gangster related type stuff, or he just...
Somebody, a very smart, nice woman has done an enormous amount of research on John and is doing a musical play about him. So I will leave that whole thing to her. In fact, part of the vocal thing was produced in New York this winter, and I did an introduction to it. It's kind of interesting. She's got the John Mitchell story. And I keep forgetting that, I knew the genesis of some of these places years ago. Maybe I should have read up on it before we talked, but honestly.
Well, you lived it.
I don't remember all of it.
So he started paying people.
The first one that I knew was the Commons.
Okay.
The Commons was...
Which was also on MacDougal?
It's right across the street.
Yeah.
It once was a big stable. And then...
Was that Panchitos at one time, and then I think the Fat Black Pussycat was in there?
It became the Fat Black,
and it had the back door also to the alley. Right.
Yeah.
So that was the Commons.
That was the Commons, and that was the first place, really, where folk singers played.
For money, for more than the basket.
No, for the basket.
For the basket.
For the basket. But the basket wasn't bad. It was a huge place. It booked a lot. A lot of people would come in.
Yeah.
David was booking either the hoot and the basket or the whole thing. I don't remember. I just do remember, and I have it. Again, I have it in the book. I wrote that book out of my head. I do remember that even in the Commons, when he was working, he was bringing home $200 a night.
Yeah. Wow.
$200 a week. I'm sorry.
Yeah, still a lot, right?
That was an enormous amount of money in the early 1960s, and nobody took out tax, and nobody took out Social Security, and nobody took out medical insurance.
Nobody was asking for it.
Nobody was asking anything. We were kids. We were happy. Then everybody moved over to the Gaslight.
Okay. Across the street.
Yeah, and then you started having other coffee houses open. The other coffee houses were all basket houses, but they were there, including the Wah and, all those other places.
Right.
And yes, then you started having music pouring out of places on MacDougal Street and
Right.
3rd Street and Bleecker Street.
As far as city blocks goes, it's 4 or 5 city blocks, and it's just a couple of side streets that are going east-west, and MacDougal going north-south. But 3rd and Bleecker parallel. Do you remember when they just started appearing, these coffee houses?
It was 61.
61,
It was about 61.
started springing up?
They started springing up, yeah. By 63, there was literally music pouring out of the streets and tourists pouring all over the streets.
Yeah.
And we, who were making a living off those tourists, despised them. Yeah,
But you needed them there because the house had to be turned.
They supported it. They supported the folk singers.
Sure.
And the Bitter End opened around the corner. And by then, Gerde's was one of, if not the leading club, several blocks east. It was a little out of the way east and a teeny bit north.
So Gerde's Folk City was at West 4th and Mercer, 11 West 4th, and that's my connection to the whole scene, as it were. At an advanced age of 40, I jumped in and started contacting everyone that I could get that would reply to an email or a phone call, and mostly they did because of Mike Porco. So many people welcomed me to their homes, and then within a few short months, I had hosted the 50th anniversary concert, and that's how I met Suze, and who introduced me to you, Suze Rotolo. Little did we know how little more time we had with Suze. She left in 2011. Suddenly, I was unaware we weren't that close to that I knew that she was ill. So Mike Porco had an Italian restaurant that he bought in 1952 with his cousins. In 1959 is when Izzy Young walked in and offered up doing folk music at night, but not a basket house, because Mike Porco was as Dave Van Ronk put in his book, it was a Class B cabaret room. So you had to be a member of the union, you had to have a cabaret card, and it paid $90 a week. And so a minimum of $90 a week. Whether you were act of 10 or an act of 2 or an act of 1, you got $90, which was a lot of money for a week.
The liquor club thing and the cabaret thing, just to make it simple, is because it served booze.
Alcohol.
It was different from the other places, whether they were basket houses and you passed a basket, or paid a salary like the Gaslight and then the Bitter End. Those were coffee houses. They did not serve liquor. If you served liquor, you were subject, and the performers were subject to certain laws.
Right.
And just to take that a step further, it was kind of interesting because in I can't remember the year, 63, 64, somewhere around there, Dave and some of the guys, the performers from the Gaslight, and me, because I was a socialist, organized the performers in the basket houses. And we got them to say to the owners of the basket houses, we want a salary.
Yeah.
We don't want to be subject to the
nickels and dimes.
Yeah. And they were ready to walk out. They were ready to have salaries. And so armed with that, the people who worked at the Gaslight and got salaries were not necessarily members of the musicians union. You didn't have to be, because it was a coffee house. So we decided to, we were good union people. We went to Local 802 of the American Federation of Musicians, which was the New York City local, and we said, all of the folk singers in the village want to join the union. Come organize us. And they looked at us and they said, folk singers aren't musicians, go away.
Yeah.
But if you were a folk singer and you happened to work in a liquor club, then you were de facto a musician, and you had to join the union.
Right. Or you didn't get to work there.
You didn't get to work there.
You weren't hired.
Yeah. A curious conjunction of
how
things worked.
So Dave Van Ronk, he worked at Gerde's occasionally, but he spent a lot of social time there. But his main base of operations was
the Gaslight.
The Gaslight on MacDougal.
Yeah.
And so would you say he was there 5 days a week, 6 days a week? What kind of...
Dave worked at the Gaslight several weeks a year. He wound up managing the Hoot there. Mm-hmm. I hate the word hootenanny. Yeah. I've always hated the name hootenanny. But that's what it was called.
Which is an open mic.
An open mic, but it was called the Hoot. Mm-hmm. And then we hung out there because there were a lot of musicians there. In the early years of the village, when the village had a folk scene, there weren't a lot of places out of New York to work. Mm-hmm. So as the New York clubs opened, this is part of the Dylan thing. Mm-hmm. People came to New York. Suddenly you had people from out of town coming to New York to make a living and to be heard and to be part of this burgeoning scene. Right. So you had Tom Paxton, who came in from, moved here from Oklahoma. You had Bob, who came here from Minnesota. You had
Phil Oakes, Ohio.
Yeah. And they all came to New York. And incidentally, what I said earlier about a lot of the young people who were part of the Folk Singers Guild dropped out. They didn't have that drive at that point, They didn't stick it and stay. Yeah. It was a little, when they were around, it was a little too early. You had a lot of New York kids who stayed and became part of it. Danny Kalb, who was a guitar student of Dave's and brilliant musician, and became a leading part of the music scene, and a whole lot of others. Yeah. MacDougal Street, in particular, became a social scene. The Gaslight and the Kettle of Fish, which was a bar next door. Street level. And Izzy Young's Folklore Center. 2 more doors down. Were kind of the heart of it.
That was the heart, sure.
They were the heart of it.
Yeah. That's why I mentioned before that where Gerde's was, MacDougal is closer to 6th Avenue and the square is still a little bit further east, and then Gerde's was a little further east than that.
It's a ways away.
Yeah,
it's a ways away.
Right.
It's a ways away. You could go to MacDougal Street, and you could tumble into any one, and if you're a performer, you were not charged admission.
Right.
I never paid, and I wasn't a performer, but even before I started to manage musicians, nobody ever charged me.
Yeah.
You could tumble in and out of any club, and nobody ever asked for money. So it became a big social thing.
Right.
Or you could plop down in the kettle and drink.
Yeah.
Or not drink.
You can hang out.
Yeah. And hang out. Whereas going over to Gerde's involved a little more effort.
Yeah.
A little more effort. We all knew who was performing everywhere, all the time. You had to go over there and be prepared to sit and be somewhat quiet for a while and listen.
Right. It was a destination club.
It was a little more a destination club. Yeah. Dave and I, or just me, when David started working out of town, was around MacDougal Street night after night after night.
Right.
And when we weren't on MacDougal Street, people were in our apartment.
Yeah.
I mean, we ran kind of a hotel.
Yeah. A lot of couch surfers. People stay on the couch.
Yeah, people stay. We had an apartment. We had furniture. We had books and records. We fed people. I cooked.
Yeah. Right. What's not to like?
We played music for people.
Yeah.
We lectured them interminably on left-wing politics.
Right.
I'm sure we bored the hell out of them, and we got stoned.
Yeah. I arrived here today at 4:20, oddly enough.
That's right.
I noticed.
Yeah.
Let's take a quick break. Go to Amazon to buy Terri Thal's memoir, My Greenwich Village, Dave, Bob, and Me, and subscribe to my Substack to watch Positively Porco at the Gerde's Folk City doc for as little as a gift of $5 or join monthly. And we're back with the Unnamed Bob Porco podcast with Terri Thal. I implore you all to get Elijah Wall's book, The Mayor of MacDougal Street, written about Dave Van Ronk, and Terri Thal's own book, My Greenwich Village, Dave, Bob, and Me, where Terri has put my name in there. Thank you, Terri, on page 100. Mike's grandson, Bob Porco, has spent years keeping the spirit of the club alive.
And I did it without being asked.
He interviewed many people. Yeah, that's right. I didn't twist your arm to do that.
Not a word.
He interviewed many people who had been associated with it for the film he hoped to make, which I just put out on Substack, called the Gerde's Folk City Doc, if you haven't found it. I've always regretted putting him off. I did so not because I didn't want to be in the film, but at that time I was trying to organize stuff in the house that's 30 miles from Manhattan, where Paul and I had moved. If Bob ever makes the film and I'm not in it, I'll be angry with myself. Well, here's Terri Thal.
And I was. The film was made. And
she's angry.
I was angry.
And she's angry with herself.
I was angry with that.
So you're going to be shoehorned in there. I'm going to just take it off the Substack and edit in Terri Thal. And she's given us a great history of the Greenwich Village scene. I'm very grateful to be here with her in my first podcast. And I want to point out one thing again. Let's see. We're going to go back to our friend Bob, who is probably the brightest star to come out of Gerde's, Bob Dylan. And it says here in her section, Managing Bob. One day in spring, 1961, Bob asked, "Would you get me gigs?" Of course, I said, "I'll try." And a little further down it says, "Getting Bob work was difficult. Folk singers in New York started to agree with Dave and me that Bob was distinctive and remarkable and that he had great promise." So what did you hear from a 20-year-old Bob Dylan? What kind of... Was the timing? He didn't really have much words, many words of his own.
He didn't, and he wasn't writing songs yet. It was more, I'm not sure. I've never really figured it out, and I've heard a lot of people talk about it.
What made other people crappy then, that made him not crappy?
They weren't crappy. They weren't crappy. It was different.
Yeah.
They weren't crappy. He was music plus. Mm-hmm. They were... wonderful singers, they were wonderful guitarists, they were wonderful arrangers. He was not necessarily, as I said before, he wasn't any of those, or I didn't think so. He brought something in addition.
Go to Amazon to buy Terri Thal's memoir, My Greenwich Village, Dave, Bob, and Me, and subscribe to my Substack to watch Positively Porco, the Gerde's Folk City Doc, for as little as a gift of $5 or join monthly.